Welcome back to the Hardware Unboxed podcast for episode 67. This is a Steve rant video. If you've been following the Hardware Unboxed channel, another channel, Pro High Tech, made a video calling out some of Steve's testing, and boy, was Steve unimpressed. So you would have seen the video on Hardware Unboxed. There's been some follow-up comments made. We're going to be talking about that, breaking down some of the things that we feel really not overly acceptable about what's happened, and yeah, some of Steve's spicy opinions. So Steve's looking at me like I've just burnt him by saying he's got spicy opinions on this. But anyway, if you enjoy that sort of thing, that's what this episode's about. So let's get into it. Steve, I hear you've angered the Russians this week.
I guess that's a lead-in. Could have, yeah. I guess we'll talk about it for those who. Well, if you haven't seen the latest Arc CPU overhead video, then this podcast is going to be a bit weird. So I'd suggest going and watching that video first if you're interested in listening to this podcast, because we're sort of addressing the aftermath of that video. I'm probably talking about it a bit more. Obviously, that's going to be, I think, the main theme of this podcast. So, yeah, Watch that video, come back. Listen to podcast. What's the short story here, Tim?
Well, it's basically, it sounds like, well, basically it goes back to the Arc B580 reviews. You reviewed it, and then it later came out that there was some CPU overhead issues with the Arc B580, first reported by places like Hardware Canucks. Then you confirmed their testing in a video on the Hardware Unboxed channel, which had accurate testing. And then a Russian channel called Pro High Tech. Have I got that right? Pro High?
Yes, I believe. Yep. Pro High Tech.
Pro High Tech made a Russian language video basically saying that your testing was incorrect and so on. Bit more to it than that. Some potentially calling your video maybe fake or a forgery. We'll have to talk about the language barrier at some point.
Yeah, that's right.
But then you made a video responding to that, basically saying, well, no, the testing is accurate. And to test CPU overhead, you can't just test GPU limited, which was basically what the Pro High Tech video was about. And then since we published that video, Pro High Tech has made a response, or at least comments, pinned some things. Again, his comments have always been in Russian, so we've had to translate them. So that's where we're at today. So we're probably going to be talking about the response, the language barrier, that sort of thing in today's podcast. So don't you just love drama, YouTube drama? We're creating it for people. So isn't that nice?
That's just lovely. So to get back to how we sort of got here, the Arc overhead issue was known about well before, I guess, like we didn't discover it. And Hardware Canucks didn't discover it either, but they were the first to really expose it as probably being a potential problem for the B580. It goes back to really when the A770 was released a few years prior. People started pairing that thing with really low-end systems because it was, at times, a very affordable GPU, and they noticed the performance was quite bad. The reason why we didn't pick up on the story or really cover it is because the A770 was really a dead-on-arrival product, in our opinion, and none of the future price cuts really made it a product that was worth recommending or looking into, at least based on pricing we saw in the US and here in Australia. It was always just buy an RX 6600. They were generally the same price or cheaper. Didn't have any of the questionable driver support issues and things like that. Worked in older games a lot better because it makes sense, right? They've got much more of a history, much more time to build up their driver support. So A770 product we didn't really cover, therefore we didn't really. I was going to say we never looked at any fault benchmarks. I don't know if that was true. I know we did an A770 like revisit, and you did how many like. How does the A770 handle my Steam library? So we did some follow-up content, but compared to what we would normally do, we did basically none. And that's because it was a product we were not recommending. So that's why there was no exploration into CPU overhead stuff that people were talking about and complaining about. We'd kind of brushed it aside and said, bit of a fail. We'll see where things progress from here. B580, we got that like 3 months ago now, or something like that, 3 to 4 months ago. Great product at the alleged $250 US MSRP. And I say alleged because I don't think we've seen it at $250 US outside of a couple of early sort of reference cards. It's still like $330 in the US. And here in Australia, it's about the same price as the outgoing RTX 4060 8GB. Arguably a better product than that. But again, at the same price as an RTX 4060, especially for budget builders, the GeForce GPU is a better buy. So even the B580, bit of a fail. But anyway, 3 months ago now, Hardware Canucks made a video really highlighting the issue very clearly. We followed up on it and we're like, yeah, for those of you with older Ryzen CPUs, the really popular Ryzen 5 3600, lots of people, this may be hard for some of you to believe, but lots and lots and lots of people interested in affordable GPUs are still gaming on something like a Ryzen 5 3600. I always crack up when people are like, there's no way people are still using a 3600. It's so old. Just upgrade. It's like, yeah, a 5700 X3D is a much better CPU, but it's still $200 US. And if you're a young kid or someone who doesn't have $200 US to spend on a CPU and your Ryzen 5 3600 still works, you can conceivably pair that with a more modern entry-level GPU and still get great performance in a lot of the esports type titles and stuff.
It's a $250. It's a $250 product. Like, what, are you going to double the price of the product to get a better CPU? Like, go from $250 to $450 to buy it plus the CPU you need to run it. Completely throws the value equation in the trash.
Yes. So again, I agree. Ryzen 5 3600 is quite a dated processor now. But I can also throw a Ryzen 5 3600 in a system with RTX 4060 and show you very acceptable performance in a wide range of games. So while I get where people are coming from on that, it's not really a valid or great argument. So that's that on the sort of, B580 overhead. Is it relevant to those sort of CPUs? So that all happened. Since then, there have been admittedly very few tests that probably from more, I don't want to say trusted sources because, well-known sources aren't necessarily more trusted than smaller YouTubers. So the amount of subs you have doesn't necessarily dictate or suggest how trusted you should be, but it's more, you build a reputation over time, right? You point out things, you benchmark things, you do a lot of day one coverage, and the more of that stuff you get right, you build up a reputation. So there hasn't been too many guys who have really dug in and looked at it that have been around in the game a bit. But 3 weeks ago, and I missed this, Digital Foundry finally, come on guys, a bit slow, got out their review of the B570. I'm joking. I'm just lightly ribbing Digital Foundry on how slow they were to get their B570 review up. But, people are busy, may not have worked with their schedule or whatever. But they did a great job of their review and they looked at the CPU overhead issue. And I criticized Pro High Tech for looking into it and using mostly canned benchmarks, especially in like Cyberpunk. But the Cyberpunk canned benchmark it does use the CPU, but not nearly to the degree that you will see CPU usage in an area like Dogtown, especially with high crowd density. So playing the game is certainly in multiple sections much more demanding than the built-in benchmark, which was more my point there. But Digital Foundry used a Ryzen 5 3600, which I've also used to highlight this issue, and it's a great processor to use because, first of all, wildly popular. A lot of people still use it, and it is on the sort of older side now, more limited in performance, and therefore highlights it really well. So Digital Foundry used the built-in benchmark, and they showed that, like what we showed, with a Ryzen 5 3600, the performance just falls off a cliff. And that's not to do with PCIe bandwidth. It's not to do with resize or bar. It's to do with how much more the GPU is, how much more load the GPU is placing on the CPU. It's maxing out the CPU, and therefore you're losing performance because you're running your CPU at its maximum capacity. So prior to the Pro High Tech video, you had an additional source. So you had Hardware Canucks at this point, which they didn't even mention. Sorry, I just hit my keyboard. You had Hardware Unboxed, and Digital Foundry had now done testing and showed in a few examples that the CPU overhead issue is absolutely a real thing. It's not a myth. It's not even something that you have to benchmark in really unrealistic configurations to expose. Again, if we're talking about an RTX 5090, then I think talking about Ryzen 5 3600 performance is absolutely absurd.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're talking about the cheapest GPU, newly released GPU that you've, again, at the alleged price, head out, like, when was the last $250 GPU worth recommending? 4 years ago?
Yeah. Yep.
So it's been the cheapest GPU worth recommending, 12 gigabytes of VRAM, in forever. So it is absolutely something that budget gamers are going to want. The guys that buy the old or the old OEM PCs, the Dell PCs and stuff like that, and try and get like PCIe connectors to power cards. These are the kind of guys who are going to buy these. Again, guys with entry-level systems. So the overhead issue is an issue. Now, we didn't pitch it as a deal breaker or anything like that. It's more, we highly recommended this card. We said for the most part, no real faults. The only probably concern with a B580 at the point of initially reviewing it would have been, ongoing driver support. There's still games that there was still games that had the odd issue, and then newly released games, Intel's generally a bit slower than, Nvidia and AMD to dial in the driver support, let's say. So there were those concerns, but outside of that, we were kind of like, best bang for your buck, awesome entry-level GPU, have at it. But then it turned out that, well, if you have an older CPU, it's well worth being aware of this issue. So we were trying to provide everyone with the information. Look, if you have a Ryzen 5 5600 or faster, it's going to be less of an issue. And certainly if you have a more modern entry, like, a Core i5 12400 or, a Ryzen 7 5700X 3D, far less of an issue. But at the same time, you've also got to be aware that games are continuing to become increasingly CPU demanding. So if you do buy a B580 over one of the competing GPUs, your 5700X 3D isn't going to go as far as it would otherwise. It seems like there's about a 20% overhead when the CPU is getting maxed out, because we often see about a 20% performance reduction with the B580 when going with a slower CPU. Sort of a rough estimate. But you are going to get less out of your CPU. It's not going to go as far as it would with, say, a GeForce GPU or a Radeon GPU. So that's also something that you kind of have to factor into the value equation, which is quite difficult. Because the VRAM is something you can pitch as, here's a future-proofed angle. I mean, already 8 gigabytes of VRAM kind of sucks. 12 gigabytes is sort of the bare minimum. So you can say, well, certainly over the next 2 years, you're going to want 12 gigabytes of VRAM over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. I think pretty much most people can agree upon that. But then that future-proof angle is diminished when it's like, well, you're going to need to spend more on your CPU in 2 years' time as well, because it's going to require more of your CPU. So there's all that. But in summary, we weren't saying it was a deal breaker. Really, our conclusion was this sort of newly discovered information that we're wrapping our head around. We're really unsure of what it means for the recommendation of the B580. We don't really know how the product's going to age. We don't know in 2 years from now what an RTX 4060 versus B580 comparison on a 5700X 3D is going to look like. If games become considerably more CPU demanding within that 2 year period, then the GeForce GPU may actually end up aging better, despite the fact that it doesn't have enough VRAM. I'm not really calling it one way or the other. It's more, I don't actually know. This is sort of new territory for us. We don't have too many of these severe overhead things where we can really point to how they play out. But it's definitely a con that you need to be aware of. So that's sort of where we're at with the content to date, I think. Have you got anything to add to that?
No, not really. I mean, I think that's where we were up until the Pro High Tech video, right? Because I think the first mistake that video made was the assumption, the misconception actually is probably a better way of putting it, that we see in testing sometimes that, GPUs are always going to be GPU limited, especially when we're talking about, for example, the low end configurations. Because there can be this misconception that okay, a 5090 can be CPU limited because it's so powerful. Like you're going to be, if you're not playing it at 4K, chances are you will run into CPU limited scenarios. But as you get lower and lower and lower in your GPU, the GPU becomes worse.
I'll just add that it's CPU limited in the sense that you're throwing the most powerful CPU at it. It's not CPU limited because there is an architectural or driver limitation that's requiring more of that. I mean, we have seen an overhead issue with NVIDIA to a lesser degree than this one, admittedly. But it's a different reason for why you're CPU limited, I guess.
Yeah, that's what's happened in the past, right? It's been no overhead really that's factored in. It's purely about the power of the graphics card. If it's more powerful, you need a more powerful CPU to throughput the number of frames that's required. The lower end stuff, because they're weaker products, tend to be thought of as being less CPU limited because they're just less powerful.
Yes.
Whereas that is, even ignoring the overhead issue, there are certainly games where it can appear that you're largely GPU limited until certain points, especially with single player games. Like in the Cyberpunk example, the benchmark does run through a real part, a real section of the game. That part, the bar that you see goes outside, you can get there in the game. But when you get to later parts of the game, Dogtown in the expansion, much more CPU demanding because there's an area with lots of NPCs. So, and that happens across lots of games. If you test Starfield, for example, if you're on many planets, not very CPU demanding at all, it's just open fields and stuff like that. You go to some of the settlements, very CPU demanding. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, a game which isn't as CPU demanding in general. Most of the game pretty light. You get to the large city area towards the end of the game, you have to play like 50 hours in or something. You get to this larger city, it's more CPU demanding. And so with these GPUs, there can be this tendency to think, I'll never be CPU limited with this card because I'm always going to be GPU limited in games. That's how most benchmarkers test games, is using, at least for a GPU review, you try and make it GPU limited. But there are plenty of realistic conditions where parts of the game will be CPU limited even on more entry-level configurations. And that can be really problematic because you might have this nice playable experience. You might be getting 80 FPS, which would be a good outcome on an entry-level card. But then suddenly you're hitting that city area later in the game and your performance falls off a cliff. And especially if that's caused by some overhead issue that you're not getting on a competitive product, that can really hurt the gaming experience. And as someone that plays tons of single-player games, there's been so many times when it really depends where you test in the game as to whether you're testing the GPU or testing the CPU, and both components can be very important.
Yeah, that's right. And typically, if we can, I try to pick demanding sections that require a lot of both components. So we do that in Space Marine 2 and, The Last of Us Part 2, we're doing that now. And a lot of the games we try to find a really CPU demanding section because you don't want to get to that section, as you said, have the performance fall off a cliff. You want to know really when you get to the most demanding sections of the game, what is the performance like and how do certain hardware configurations compare. And it's not like we find outlier cases within the game. It's sort of like the typical high load throughout the game, because in a lot of games you spend a lot of time in the town sections and stuff like that. Not a whole lot of fun if the bulk of the game, like in Star Wars Outlaws or whatever, when you're in an establishment, it's running like garbage. And then when you go off, like you sort of said in Starfield, to basically a desert, then the frame rate's great, but there's not much to do there. So yeah, it's a bit of a balancing act. We don't always pick the absolute best places to test games straight away. Sometimes it takes a bit of play through and working out and help from the community. But the goal is generally to pick those areas that sort of represent the more overall demands, what you're going to see from the game. So, but again, in a game like Cyberpunk, we test in a very typical area of the game that shows fairly typical performance for an NPC dense area. And I would say a lot of the areas within Cyberpunk, especially in the cities, are relatively densely populated. So I don't think that's unusual. You've played much more of Cyberpunk than I have. But would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, most of the game takes place in the city areas, and obviously the Dogtown area, there's a few areas in the main city as well, the non-expansion part, that are quite demanding as well. But yeah, if you go out into the desert, I mean, the parts of the game do take place in those places, but if you're going to be playing, let's say, in the Dogtown area for 5 to 10 hours, then if that's a really unpleasant experience, and that's important, more important than if the desert is running well, but Dogtown's running poorly. You know what I mean? So,
well, that's the
yeah.
feedback we've certainly got from gamers in the past. That's the areas they want tested because they get really frustrated when a lighter area of the game's tested and you're like, all you need here is this CPU with this GPU and the game plays great. And then they play for 5 hours or whatever, and then they have to spend an hour or two in some sort of area that the performance is halved or certainly much more demanding in those other sections. So a bit of a balancing act working all of that out. And yeah, I think we've got certainly Cyberpunk testing Dogtown is a great area. I think the market section in the town in A Plague Tale Requiem is another great place to test because the GPU load is, well, it's as demanding as anywhere else in the game, but there is a lot more NPCs there, so there's much more asked of your CPU. And it's really interesting how much that changes the performance, even of what the CPU is able to deliver compared to other sections of the game, so where the bottlenecks occur. So that's pretty well established. I think a lot of reviewers try to do that, but we're not doing anything like it's not like crazy cherry picking weird, unusual scenarios and ways in which you wouldn't play the game. It's meant to be pretty representative of a heavy load within that game. And I think most people agree that's the case. And again, built-in benchmarks, generally speaking, not always, but by and large, aren't very good at doing that, especially on the CPU side.
Yep.
So that's sort of, we can start to get into it now. So it would have been close to 2 weeks ago now. So it was actually when I was at the air show, or going to the air show. So when I had that little holiday, I was away with my family. I pulled out my phone and I thought I had 5 minutes to spare. I thought I'd just have a look at the channel, see how things are going. And I saw the first 2 comments were like, fake benchmarks, you should be ashamed. And I'm like, okay, well, we get the odd comments. I was like, okay, thought nothing of it. Was like, sure, buddy. Okay, whatever. Scrolled down. There was like a nice comment about, I think it was the X870 motherboard roundup saying, great work, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's nice. There we go. I'm feeling good again. Scroll down. And then I was just seeing heaps of these comments about fake benchmarks, cheaters, all these random words used. And it sort of didn't seem like native English speakers either, the way a lot of the comments were phrased. I'm like, the hell is going on here? And I kept scrolling. There was like another page of them, and they were all on the B580 re-review and the 2 initial overhead videos I did. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, okay, so there's a B580 link here. Someone's made a video calling us out for something. What's going on? Kept scrolling. And then I finally found 2 comments. One said, hey, Steve, I thought I should just let you know that a Russian YouTuber is running a disinformation campaign with Intel on your B580 content. I'm like, oh, really? Okay. And then I scrolled a bit further and one guy was like, again, fake benchmarks. You've been exposed by Pro High Tech. I was like, oh, okay. So I typed in Pro High Tech, found the video. And I didn't have much time, so I sort of watched it and I was like, okay, I don't really know what's going on here. I'll deal with this later. So I went and enjoyed my day, forgot about it. Came back, looked into it, started looking at their facts and figures and trying to work out what the hell was going on and why all these people are saying fake benchmarks. And yeah, started to dig into it. I'm like, oh, okay, so this guy's, it appears, testing for the CPU overhead issue, but he's heavily GPU limited and he's using built-in benchmarks or open areas of the game with no NPCs. This seems like a pretty bad way to try and verify what we already know to be true. And I wasn't really sweating it. I wasn't like, oh my God, what mistake have we made? Have we said that there's an overhead issue here and there really isn't? I was more confused because I'm like, well, we were merely confirming the results of someone else and found the results to be correct. Others have since found the results to be correct. And Intel themselves are like, yeah, that's expected behavior in those few games, and they just downplayed it, saying it's only going to happen in a few games with certain hardware configurations. We'll look into it and see if we can optimize it, and we'll let you know. So it wasn't like Intel was like, no, that data you're seeing is wrong. We're not able to replicate that in-house. They were like, yep, no, that's to be expected with those configurations, and that's why we recommend using it with a more modern platform in the fine print, the system requirement sort of stuff. So
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Because I would have thought, if I was going out to investigate the Arc overhead issue, or let's say, for example, be reasonable, right? Why would you reinvestigate this? Maybe you're getting some comments saying, I've bought a B580, it's great. Not seeing the overhead issue. Why are people talking about the overhead issue? So you want to look into it. The first thing I would do is look at how the other channels have tested it. So I'd look at your video, I'd look at the Hardware Canucks video and Digital Foundry and whatever, and have a look at what are the configurations used, the games where they're testing it, and I would replicate that as close as I possibly could. And so I'd be testing in those exact scenarios that you've shown. You've always shown where you test in the corner of videos. Some people seem unaware of this, but
even so, I didn't need Hardware Canucks to tell me how to test CPU limited performance in video games. I don't need Hardware Canucks to do that.
Sure.
They're very competent. They can do their testing. If they say there's an overhead issue, that is all the information I need to confirm and look into that. But go on.
Yeah, of course. Like, you're an experienced reviewer. I'm more someone who maybe doesn't know exactly what a CPU overhead issue is. Testing anything, really, if you're not sure what's going on, get the configuration the same or as close as possible. Go back in, see whether on your system with the very similar configuration, you're seeing the same thing. And then if people are saying, well, I'm not seeing an issue, you can make a video about that and talk about where you may see the CPU overhead issue and where you may not, and sort of show, okay, well, in these configurations, you won't see the CPU overhead issue because your GPU limited or your CPU is powerful enough or whatever. But first, you can't just go into denial mode and sort of say, there's no CPU overhead issue because I tested this different configuration. Like, there's no...
Which is frustrating. It
doesn't match up.
No, that's right. And it's frustrating because in my initial re-review, which doesn't sound like an initial video, but it was. Let's say my re-evaluation, because that probably makes more sense in English. I showed deliberately GPU limited scenarios and said, guys, I need to stress that this isn't necessarily a deal breaker. It does depend heavily on your configuration, though there are some unknowns. But look, here's a Plague Tale Requiem running ultra settings that makes the game more GPU limited, even in my CPU demanding test, and we're not seeing the problem. But if you want higher than, I can't remember what the FPS was, let's say 60. If you want 100 FPS, so you're willing to dial down to medium, you can't do it because the CPU overhead for a Ryzen 5 5600 limits the performance before you can get there. And it becomes more severe the less CPU power you have to throw at it. So we were really clear. Same thing with Cyberpunk. We showed Cyberpunk with the medium crowd density setting, and there was no problem. But if we cranked it up to high, then you lost 20% performance with the B580, whereas you didn't with the GeForce GPU because it had the extra CPU headroom. So we're very transparent about this isn't always a problem. In some games, there are workarounds if you can lighten the CPU load. But the real key takeaway was, even at 1440p, if you want to employ upscaling, dial down the quality settings, and you want to go for more of a high refresh rate experience, even if it's like 100, 120 FPS, often very difficult to achieve with a B580 using sort of a more mid-range CPU. So it was frustrating that we not only said that in the video, but also had numerous graphs. Like, we had 10 times more graphs than the Pro High-Tech video. We really covered all bases. And I really went out of my way to clearly explain this issue. And I had quite a bit of experience with it because we were one of the few media outlets that really dug in and exposed some of the DirectX 12 overhead issues with the GeForce GPUs that I think they've probably improved at this point, but I don't know for sure. But, back a few generations, it was more noticeable with lower end CPUs. But anyway, I had a fair bit of experience, knew how to tackle the subject, and we really covered it from all angles. So it wasn't just nitpicking a couple of edge cases and saying, look how bad it is in Spider-Man and Space Marine 2, don't buy these. Anyone accusing us of that, well, they're being dishonest because that wasn't at all what we did. And then, so Pro High Tech made a video, and now there are some things with their video that we know for sure they did, and there are some things that either they were done dirty by the auto translate, or there's a bit of context missing due to the language barrier and stuff. So and I did acknowledge that in my video, saying it's difficult to know just how out of line the Pro High-Tech comments are, but it was quite clear that they were claiming unequivocally that our testing was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Why it was wrong, they either didn't know or speculated, depending on how the language translation goes. But they, as far as I can tell, and this seems pretty clear, that the goal of the video was to explore our claims and give them a yay or a nay.
Mm-hmm.
And they nayed them. And then,
yeah, that's right.
You know, the word forgery was used in the title. Perhaps, again, the context of that and how it's used and the meaning of that in Russian, the Russian language is different to most of the English languages, depending on where you are around the world. What were you going to say, Tim?
I was just going to say, yeah, some people reached out that speak Russian, providing a different interpretation of some of those words, but not the whole context of the video in terms of like them trying to disprove that it was wrong. It was more things like some people had focused on the word crooked, which,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in an English interpretation typically means you're a crook, right? Like you've done
dodgy,
doing something dirty or dodgy or a criminal. Mm-hmm. Whereas it seems like in the Russian language, at least in that context, meant more broken or wrong or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, how well you translate it, how well you understand like the context of Russian does change it from being either just disproving your content and saying it's wrong, or disproving your content, saying it's wrong, and claiming that you've been really dodgy and dirty and faked it, basically. So it's somewhere on that spectrum.
Yeah, and I heard someone was telling me that where they said, you know, maybe Hardware Unboxed just saw this blogger who was making these CPU overhead claims, and then they just took the percentages and made their own calculations, then made up the graphs. And that was more of a joke, like it was not a serious thing. Which, okay, fair enough. It's a weird sort of implication to add, though, because if you're saying, we can't verify these results, they don't seem right, and then you're joking about how maybe they just faked it all, that explains why so many Russians were led to believe that the graphs were fake and the testing was fake and that we needed to show actual gameplay. So you've got to be really careful with that stuff. If you're going to take screen grabs and screenshots and data from someone else, like if we were to do that to Gamers Nexus, for example, we'd have to be very clear with the language we used around the testing and extremely careful not to insinuate or even suggest in the slightest ha-ha joke way that maybe they fake it, maybe they made it up, maybe they calculated it, maybe they just put some numbers into Excel and that's how they got to their conclusion. So I don't really want to dig into that, and you know, the sort of name calling thing that was it seemed like they were doing that. The context seemed really weird, so that was a bit more fuel to the fire. But I guess I'm happy to push that aside. So that was a misunderstanding, and if it was, you know, apologize to Pro High-Tech for taking what they said, getting misled by the auto translate, because there is a huge language barrier there. So that is very difficult. So let's just push that aside, and if that was the case, then apologies, and let's just not waste any more time on it. I'd rather focus on, I mean, there is some weird stuff that we sort of probably have to go through on their response, which we can dig into in a second. But leaving that for a moment, the things that we do know, so the stuff that we know without the language barrier being a problem, is we know the numbers they posted. We know how they tested. We sort of know what the goal of the video was. And the goal of the video was to look into the claims of the Arc overhead issue. And for some reason, they made us the poster boy of this issue. Like, we're the only ones that have exposed it. We're the only ones that have really talked about it.
You're in the thumbnail, aren't you?
I'm in the thumbnail, yes. So I'm the only one on the Arc overhead side of the fence in the thumbnail. So I'm representing this, what is a conspiracy theory, because they're saying it's not real, right? Like, I'm making up this story and I'm the face of the Arc overhead issue. And Hardware Canucks, Digital Foundry, all the other guys that have talked about this weren't mentioned. They were sort of making out that we're the only ones that are saying this. So after 3 months, no one else has looked into it. So that's definitely the case. Like that's the case. And then they looked into it while being heavily GPU limited in all of their tests. They didn't attempt to be CPU limited, and they ignored the absolute worst, the worst cases that we, Digital Foundry and Hardware Canucks showed. They ignored those worst cases, whether it was the worst case hardware configurations or the worst case games tested. So they ignored like if you're going to look into this and someone's been like, you see half the performance in War Thunder, Spider-Man, and then you see like a 10 to maybe upwards of 20% performance loss in certain demanding sections of Cyberpunk and A Plague Tale Requiem. Why only test those 2 games when you've got Spider-Man and a free-to-play game? And a Russian not testing War Thunder's pretty funny anyway, I guess. They love those. They love those war games, don't they? Like war.
It's a Russian game, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. World of Tanks and all that. Like they're Russian developers. So I don't think they've been bought out or anything. Anyway, that's not really the point. The point is they ignored the worst, most easy to produce examples of the CPU overhead.
What the reasons? It's Hungarian. Just to clarify, I think it's Hungarian.
You know what? I'm not going into those waters. I was going to make a joke. Enough drama.
I think it's founded by Russians, but it's based in Hungary. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Keep going.
Tim, you're potentially wading us into waters we do not want to venture into. And mind you, while I'm on, we're here, I did see a lot of like negative comments about Russians in general and stuff in our video. Like it's just been, and we are not about that at all. We very much appreciate, love our Russian viewers, and we don't judge people based on groups or where they're from or whatever, any of that BS. So I actually am pretty annoyed by how much of that we've seen. Yeah. So that's just a side note. Anyway, that said the bit on that. So yeah, they ignored the most damning or the worst examples of the overhead issue. Why that is, I don't know. There's no point speculating or wondering why they did that. They just did it. That's a fact. And yeah, we know the numbers. The numbers are the numbers. Like they're, so we can read them. We know the data they published. So there's no confusion there whatsoever. We know the quality settings. We know the hardware they used. We know the full configuration. So there's no confusion there. So I guess if I was aware, let's say that they didn't call our tests fake. They didn't say there was no forgery or whatever going on. Let's say like some of the people have said it was, an issue there with the language barrier. If that's the case, I probably wouldn't have addressed the video. I might have reached out to them privately and said, hey guys, there is a real issue here. Here's the Digital Foundry video. Please look at Spider-Man. If you've only got a Ryzen 5 5600, lower the clock speed, slow down the memory. You'll see the overhead issue once you reduce CPU performance. If you want to come to the conclusion that you have to exaggerate certain settings and whatever to see it, by all means do that. But you have to at least acknowledge that the Arc GPUs use more of your CPU than the GeForce GPUs because Intel themselves have acknowledged that. So you're putting yourself in a weird position if you're saying Intel's wrong about the problem that Intel's admitting to, at least to the tech media. I think they might have even in an interview said to Gamers Nexus that there is an overhead issue that they're trying to correct. I don't know. Some people said that was the case. I missed that Gamers Nexus video if they did. Something I'll have to go back and try and look into. So yeah, if it wasn't for that aspect of it, I probably would have left it alone. Do you think that's fair, Tim? Like we don't really care about people calling us out too much. Like it depends on to the degree that they're calling us out. I'd still rather, like, if this was me in their shoes and someone had said that, there's this CPU overhead issue with the B580 graphics card. So hardware Canucks, perfect example, right? It actually happened. So we investigated this because of another tech media outlet. Now, we confirmed their findings and credited them with the content being created. We didn't want to say, hey, look what we've discovered or we've found. Full credit to Hardware Canucks. Now, if we had have found that Hardware Canucks messed up or they did something wrong, and on reasonable mid-range to low-end hardware configurations, you got the same results as a 9800X 3D, I wouldn't name Hardware Canucks or call them out. I might vaguely say at the start of the video, look, we've seen a lot of chat from our viewers. A lot of you have been requesting that we look into this potential overhead issue with the B580, so that's what we're doing today. And in my conclusion, I'd say, look, based on everything we've been able to test, we can't see it. It seems like for most of you, this is still going to be a great product to buy. The performance is excellent, but it's something we'll continue to look into. Hopefully we get more reports and we can find out what's actually going on. And I would not mention Hardware Canucks at all, because I think sort of lessons were learnt on that one many, many moons ago. And you're sort of opposed to that period anyway. So
yeah, I mean, I think my general position on it is that most people doing this sort of work are trying to do their best. And so if there are errors and things, you don't want to like send off the lynch mob to go over and attack Hardware Canucks in the comments based on something that might have just been, an error or something that was perfectly honest, nothing dodgy going on. They just made a mistake. People need to learn from mistakes, which is fair enough. Hopefully they'd look at the content and improve it for next time. But no need to send the big Hardware Unboxed audience over to harass someone on that sort of video. More just, speaking. People who have seen both videos would probably know what's going on, would know that we're investigating it because of other videos. But we're not about, name dropping people and then just coming in and dumping on them. It's more about the testing. It's really the testing that's the story, the interesting thing. Can we or can we not disprove a certain thing that's been talked about? It's not about our testing versus someone else's testing, or we get it right, they get it wrong. That's not really relevant. It's more, that's what we've always tried to focus on, really, is the content, what matters. So,
then if we did feel the need for whatever reason to name Hardware Canucks in the video, if I was going to do that, I would be 100% sure that I was right. So I would have reached out to all parties involved. I probably would have spoken to Hardware Canucks directly, privately, and said, look, I've investigated this. I need more information because right now I'm disagreeing with you, and leave it to them to say what they say there. I would have reached out to the companies involved. I would have made sure I'd done at least twice as much testing as what they did. I'd be looking at it from every possible configuration, angle. And this is another reason why I do reach out and speak to and help support so many YouTubers. So there are a lot of the tech YouTube guys that I talk to leading up to a lot of these reviews, and that helps them. It also helps me. So it's beneficial to everyone. So we're not this isolated tech media outlet that doesn't speak to people. Even Steve from Gamers Nexus, speak to him a lot, ask what he's seeing, his input on things and stuff like that. So yeah, if I was going to call out another tech media outlet, I likely would have spoken to them about it, would have spoken to the manufacturer, and I would have done considerably more testing to investigate than what they did, so I'd be comfortable with my position. But more often than not, I just wouldn't feel the need to call them out. I would just let the testing, speak for itself.
I think it would be warranted if I had felt that the content was faked, for example, or something dodgy had gone on, or they were misleading their audience on purpose or for some gain. Like, especially if it was a sponsored video or something along those lines, like, oh, I've seen this video. Like, imagine if there was a video sponsored by Intel trying to disprove the overhead issue. I think it would be fair to call out a creator by name for taking that sponsorship deal.
Definitely.
But if we're talking about just mistakes were made or a misunderstanding or just differences of opinion about where to test and just differences in opinion in general, because there can be facts associated with testing, but there's also opinions. Like, I'm not going to get caught up if a creator disagrees with my subjective thoughts on FSR versus DLSS or something, I'm not going to call them out by name or make a hit piece sort of video. But I think where this sort of pro high-tech video crossed the line was putting you in the thumbnail, really focusing it on your testing as being sort of wrong, and then testing it in a way that's just blatantly incorrect. And obviously, we're not 100% sure where the language thing lies with it, but it certainly is not. To my interpretation of it and seeing the various different translations we've got, it's not. I don't think they were being particularly fair, I guess, in terms of their interpretation of your content. They weren't being generous in sort of saying like, "Oh, Hardware Unboxed has just made a mistake," and that fair enough or whatever. We're just going to go about in our own way. The video was really focused on you for some reason.
Yeah, I felt the same way. So we've been talking for a while now. Do we want to dive into their?
Yeah, let's go into the response.
So they've made they've pinned a comment on their video responding to our video, which is fine, and they've informed their viewers, and I suppose us, that they're going to look at hopefully games like Spider-Man stuff. They said, Hardware Unboxed has provided us with more information. We're going to go back and test, and if we were wrong, we will apologize. And they are wrong, so they should be apologizing. And if they do, I accept that apology. And I also apologize if I misinterpreted what they were saying, which I've already said, but I want to make that clear. And let's just get into the response. So, first,
you're going to read a translated version of the response, which is in Russian. So we should just be clear about that. Again, potential for language barrier concerns.
There's really not much else I can do about it here. So this has been Google translated. I really think the gist of these messages is pretty accurate. It's more the
individual words and tones, context, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And because, us Aussies have our unique humor. We tend to rib each other and make sort of jokes like that as well. Anyway, I'll just read it and be aware of that factor. So it starts off by saying, "We suggest you don't trust us or anyone else because they have a large audience and beautiful charts. Don't believe us, but believe what we show." It's kind of okay. "Detailed settings, gameplay, and detailed monitoring. This is our approach to testing. Maximum transparency. Feel free to ask questions and reproduce our tests. It's easy and obvious." Now, this might be a bit confusing to a few of you why the hell they're saying this, but this is actually one part that I have a really big problem with. I kind of find this, just the insinuation is I find this very dishonest. It's almost like a bit of a grift. I'm seeing more and more people be like, benchmark graphs are like, trust me, bro. And I really don't like that. That seems a bit grifty, a bit dishonest to me. So what they're saying is, don't just trust beautiful graphs. So they're talking about our blue bar graphs, presumably. But what they're saying is what you should be trusting is the gameplay, the captured gameplay with overlay statistics, because somehow that's more open and honest, that's more transparent.
Well, that was a big topic in the original video as well, was the comparison between the benchmark charts and the gameplay footage.
And the data's right if it's right, okay? So and we've seen tons of channels that do it. There are heaps of channels that have live gameplay and it's all faked. So you can fake inject overlays later. There's no way to tell what hardware configuration is being used for an overlay. It can all be faked. So
and there's been some really egregious examples of testing like cards that don't have enough memory, for example, the 8 gigabyte GPUs, and we know for a fact that area of the game tested with those claimed settings will not work on that card.
Yeah, and a lot of people fake like they've already got the B580 like 3 weeks before reviewers even get them in hand and stuff like that, and the drivers aren't even out yet, and they show performance. And then when reviewers get them in hand, it's very obvious that they faked it because the performance, they're guessing as to what it might perform like.
Well,
so,
I think there's two insinuations with this statement, though. It's what you're saying as well, the overlay charts are accurate, benchmarks are fake, which is just wrong. But the second thing is that because you use benchmark charts or something, that it's not possible to recreate your tests. Sort of this insinuation that you haven't shown enough information for someone to recreate your testing.
But that's not why we make the videos either anyway. We've done a whole lot of testing. We have a long history of doing this testing, and a lot of people have found the things we say to be true, like when we said 8 gigabytes of VRAM is not going to be enough, and this product's not going to age as well as this product, or this is how these products perform, or any of that sort of stuff. Like, we've got a really strong track record of getting all of these things right. It's not like we've been saying the 5800X 3D's this percentage faster than this processor, and then Gamers Nexus, Tech Power Up, and all the other tech media are going completely different stuff. Like, the reason why we spend so much time on this stuff and really try our best to get it as accurate as possible and do the best job we can possibly do, and we're always working on doing a better job, is to build up that credibility to be a trusted and reliable source for this information, which is why we have an audience now of 1.1 million viewers, because our conclusions and our data often aligns with other trusted sources like Gamers Nexus. So
and people buying the hardware.
Like, a lot of people tell us when they buy the hardware, it's more difficult sort of gauging the results, because you've got to be testing in the same section with the same configuration, using all the same BIOS and everything. But it's pretty ballpark. Like, you're generally not getting wildly different results.
I guess my issue with it is not so much the, should you trust us or not angle. It's that I don't think it's that hard to at least try and replicate your testing. They just didn't even try.
Well, there's that.
They just didn't even try. It's like you didn't need overlays and showing the exact benchmark area that we've tested. I mean, you do actually need the exact benchmark area, but you don't need the overlay with the benchmark area to then go and replicate that yourself. You've pointed out how they didn't test Spider-Man. Well, if you don't even bother to try and test the game, you're never going to find out whether that testing was true or not.
And the problem with that is you can test Spider-Man anywhere in the city, anywhere, and you'll find the results that we found, Harbour Canucks found. You can test Space Marine 2 in any of the Horde battles throughout the game, any of them, and you'll find the same results. But they pick a game like a Plague Tale Requiem, and then they test it in an open field without a single NPC in sight. It's like, what are you doing? That's crazy.
Yeah, and whenever I get results, like if I've seen someone's review and I get very different results, my first port of call is, well, how have I tested it? I tested it wrong. And so if I'm trying to, like for example, if it was completely not obvious where you tested a Plague Tale Requiem and you're trying to replicate those results, and you'd gotten some benchmark numbers in and the performance is much higher, you're not seeing the CPU overhead issue. The first thing I wouldn't say immediately that your testing is wrong. My first thought would be, I just haven't tested it in the same area, or I haven't done. There's some configuration I haven't gotten exactly the same or exactly right. So then I'd spend some time looking through different sections of the game or different configurations to try it and make sure I'm replicating the testing. The first response is not, well, I guess they're wrong. And so, yeah, to say like in this response and in the video as well, like that your video didn't provide enough information to replicate the testing, but they're not even bothering to try and replicate the testing or really put in any effort to do that, I think is really poor. And that's one of the things I thought was probably, I was the most disappointed in. And with these sorts of videos is the thing that I get very frustrated in is you're trying to talk about our results and try and especially say that they're wrong, at least put in some effort to try and test it in the same way, test the same areas and those sorts of things. Because, yeah, if they showed, like if they went to the area in a Plague Tale Requiem testing the same way and came out with different results, I'd be like, okay, interesting. That's really interesting. Maybe something has gone wrong. But if you're not even going to bother doing that, the whole video becomes really easy to dismiss as just like when you were showing me some of the things beforehand about how they test, I'm just like, this is a joke. Like, what's going on? Like, test it in the same way.
It was bad testing. So, again, working under the assumption, and then you know what they say about assumptions, but working under the assumption that this translation is pretty accurate, this is the problem. They're saying, believe what we show. So that is detailed settings, gameplay, and detailed monitoring. If you're not providing that, then the results aren't accurate and whatever else you're claiming is not true. But again, that's BS. I would say don't necessarily believe us either. I would say if you look at the data we're showing you and then go look at what other data you can find. So did Digital Foundry show the same thing? Yes, they did. Did Hardware Canucks show a similar thing with a low-end CPU? Yes, they did. Oh, okay. So there is clearly a CPU overhead issue. Now, to what degree it matters, how important this is for me, that's going to vary. Is it a mountain out of a molehill? Well, if you've got a 5700X 3D, maybe it is. But also maybe that'll come back to bite you in 2 years from now, and maybe being aware of this issue and paying a bit more attention could have been helpful. I don't know. Time will tell on that one. But we're not sitting here going, we're absolutely right about this, just believe us. We're saying, here's the data. We're pretty competent. We're pretty good at this. We've got a pretty good track record. Watch our stuff. As always, we often say with day one reviews, go watch everyone else. We encourage you to watch as many or read from as many sources as you can to get a more complete picture. We're never like, well, we've done the testing. No need to watch anyone else. We're the best. Anyone who does that is a grifter. You do not do that. So we would encourage you to watch, people like Pro High Tech if they have if you believe in them and they've got a good track record of doing accurate testing and that sort of stuff. We're not saying don't watch anyone or watch a selective range of people. I would advocate for watching as many as possible. So I think that's really all I've got to say about that first little paragraph. We have a lot more to go through, Tim.
Oh, no. I've got to go to dinner soon. So,
all right. Well,
crack on.
We'll try and speed run this thing. Okay. Oh, God. We're going to talk about this for a bit, I'd say, as well. They go on to say, after watching the Hardware Unboxed video, some people who watched it ended up with a strong opinion that the Arc B580 graphics card should not be purchased under any circumstances if you have an older processor, even if the author didn't say or mean it explicitly. So that's half of the paragraph. I think we'll explore that first. I mean, that's up to you to go and watch our video and see, were we misleading? Some people always come away with some strong or misled opinion because either they only heard what they wanted to, their comprehension skills aren't very good, or they're just being dishonest. They heard the truth and decided to how often do people who are fanboys cherry pick the one graph that shows them the positive result they want, and they spam that everywhere and make out that that's the overall representation of the review when it could be the complete opposite. So you have to ignore that. So what he needed to do was go watch the Hardware Unboxed video and see the numerous graphs where we showed that it's not a problem. He had to listen to what I was saying, that this isn't necessarily a deal breaker. It does depend on the CPU you have, and even then it depends on the games you play, the quality settings, and the frame rate you're targeting. I was very transparent about all of this. I explored it from multiple different angles. I wasn't like, this thing's dead on arrival. Nobody with a budget CPU can use this thing. And that's sort of what he's making out that I said. But then he sort of goes, well, even if the author didn't say or mean it explicitly. Well, I said it from all angles. I covered the topic in extreme depth. And I meant what I said. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that's all very, very fair.
Okay, cool. We'll move on. We had questions and asked Hardware Unboxed to show us where and how they tested their games. We'll come back to that. We think it's acceptable for bloggers to cross-check results for themselves or other bloggers. At the end of the day, our job is to seek the truth and inform people. We have the same job. That's crazy. Not to be too nice or to please everyone.
Right. Well, that just goes back to what I was saying before, where, so the original video is them just asking. I'm assuming that's what the translation means, that their video is asking us to provide that information.
That's right. Sorry to interrupt you. We had questions and asked Hardware Unboxed. Now, again, this is open to interpretation. It's the language translation. But to be clear to the viewers, whether this is being translated correctly or they mean this, they never asked us, as in they never reached out via publicly listed Gmail account and introduced themselves and explained what they were doing and asked for more information. The way they asked us was to make a video where they said we were wrong and then encouraged their audience to demand we told them, and again, I don't know if they used the word demand, but that's what the translation said, demand that we show how we tested, we prove ourselves, and we clear our name. So the burden has then been put on us to defend. We have done this we have this sounds a bit big-headed of myself, but it's fair to say we have made the most comprehensive, in-depth look at the B580 overhead problem and general performance of anyone. Like, I think that re-review it's tested the most games in the most configurations. We provided all of that data, and then they test just 2 of the games with 3 heavily, or at least the way they tested them, heavily GPU limited games. And then they've put this burden on us to defend ourselves and prove the way we tested. No, that's not good enough.
Yeah, and also, like, I think it would be fair to ask in a video, and again, we could be generous and say maybe the translation was over the top and maybe they were just asking for more clarity on how you had tested, like the specific areas or settings that you'd used.
That comes before the video, though.
That does come before the video, but fair enough, right? It's in maybe that's what the video said. I think that would be acceptable, and I would tolerate that more if they had bothered to at least try to test the way that you had tested. What they have actually done is at least my opinion is that that's a cop-out, that they're trying to say later afterwards, oh, we were just asking questions. We want to know how Hardware Unboxed had tested these things so we can go test it. But there's no evidence in the video that that's what they had done. Or at least that's not the takeaway I would take from that video. It's not asking how, like, where you've tested in a Plague Tale or should you test Spider-Man. No attempt was made. No attempt. So if you attempted to do that and got it wrong, or accidentally tested the wrong area, then you asked, okay, maybe we haven't tested in the right place. So, it'd be nice if Hardware Unboxed could tell us where they've tested so we can replicate it. That's very different to not bothering to test it, then later saying, we just want to ask where they tested it. It's like, okay, well, at least try.
And that's
anyway,
right.
That's just my thoughts.
Well, that's really what annoyed me, is the fact that we had already done all the hard work for you. I would love some other YouTuber to do all the hard work for us, the investigation, check the games. And in a way, Harbo Canucks did that, which is why we credited them and thanked them for their discovery. But we did add a lot. We did try to add a lot more to the conversation, not just copy their work. We added more games and found a few more. I don't think they tested War Thunder. But it was all there for them. All the hard work, all the legwork had been done. I tested like a whole heap of games and found where it didn't have the problem and examples where it did. I fairly showed the problem. I showed that it didn't apply to all games, and I showed the games where it did apply, and the games where it did apply were the newer, generally more CPU demanding games. So again, I don't really like that paragraph either. Not a great response so far. Now, this is the bit where we kind of get into the language barrier, I think. Additionally, we have never claimed that Hardware Unboxed has fake tests. In fact, we often referred to their tests before the situation when we could not reproduce their data, just as our colleague could not. We ask in the title why the result is different, but we don't blame. It's not an insult. We're trying to investigate more than just their tests from My Computer, which was the YouTuber that claimed that there was no overhead issue. And then he goes on to say, so if you consider this incitement, the big question is, who is being blamed? Hardware Unboxed or their critics? So a bit unclear what's sort of going on there. Here it is necessary to make an amendment that we have a slightly different communication culture. Okay, fair enough. Willing to accept that. Differs from the English-speaking one, which we do not always take into account, since the opening image and title were created from a Russian-speaking audience, or for a Russian-speaking audience, sorry, with a different communication culture. But perhaps in English, with direct translation, it did not sound very good. So I'm willing to accept most of that. Again, we've discussed the bit where they say we're trying to investigate more than just their tests. I think he's trying to say they're trying to investigate like the My Computer channel as well as Hardware Unboxed, and maybe that's that still doesn't really work. But anyway, most of that the vast majority of that I'm willing to accept as, yeah, okay, language barrier stuff. Maybe I got caught up too much in them saying the data was fake and whatnot. I would like a bit more clarity around the whole insinuation that we merely calculated all of our data in that video. I don't know how the translation could be so off there, but at the same time, I'm happy to let that go if we can move forward and get a more, let's say, overall view of the situation, like not just lowish frame rate GPU limited testing, but also get like some heavy CPU testing added. The next part we've sort of already addressed as well. They say, without knowing exactly where Hardware Unboxed tested, we attempted to replicate the results in the location shown in the video. We didn't know that the location in the top left corner was the exact test location and not a random gameplay location, which is, I guess, fair enough. If this was stated somewhere in the Hardware Unboxed testing methodology or written in the video, please indicate where exactly. It's like something we've said from time to time, like.
Yeah, and just going back to the translation thing, because I decided I'll put the title into ChatGPT to translate it using AI instead of Google, and they come out with the title being in English: "Faulty tests or faked results. Let's investigate and compare it with the 4060." So
that's not a title I would ever use when discussing someone else in the tech media's testing, unless I could prove, like, if it was fake, if I could prove it was fake. Otherwise, or faulty, why bring either of those insinuations, angles into the discussion at all? Again, if Gamers Nexus got different results to us, I would never jump to, is Gamers Nexus faking there? Is like, what are you doing? That's crazy. Like,
like I know it may sound, it's not as harsh as saying Hardware Unboxed faked the results, here's our testing. Asking as a question is more of a passive way of saying things, but it's not a good way. It's still saying, like, is the testing faulty or fake? And it's like, well, it's neither of those things. So anyway, I just thought, you get different results from different translations, and it's probably worth at least saying that in the podcast, what we interpret the title to be.
It's not good.
While the AI translation or the Google translation of the video says some different things, even when Russian speakers were getting back to us, they were saying, well, the title is still implying this sort of thing. And so it's really that we would have issue with. And if there was an English speaking channel saying that, I would be like, what?
Yeah, that's not great. So he said, from now on, based on what Steve says, we will assume that each Hardware Unboxed test is performed at the location shown. However, in some videos like this video from Hardware Unboxed, they don't show any gameplay, which you can't guess where they did their tests. But yeah, so again, I honestly think there is far too much getting caught up in where we're testing in the game. If the burden's on you now, if you want to test this game and you want to look into a CPU overhead issue and you're testing a Plague Tale Requiem, you don't do it in an open paddock. You look at the CPU usage monitor and you play the game for 2 hours. And then you go, oh, look, in the paddock, we were at 10% utilization, but in the town here, we're like at 40 to 50%. So that's much more demanding. This seems like the place we should test. And again, I haven't always got this right, especially straight off the bat when we've initially tested games. But if people have suggested other areas, or often I rely on Tim to play through the game and say, hey, here's my save game file, or if we can't do that, you need to play for 6 hours to this point, and that's where you can test. Oh, okay. I'll usually make Balin do it. Slave labor. No, I'm kidding. But again, I can see where some people would say, no, you need to show all this stuff and blah, 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 but there's no real rule book here. For us, it's we do our best to get it right, and we have a reputation of doing our best to get it right. And we're not doing a guide for others to replicate our testing. You either trust us or you don't. If you don't trust us, that's fine. And if these guys don't trust us, that's perfectly fine. But I wouldn't go make a video that could be viewed as somewhat of a hit piece and also get it completely wrong. But also, if they had have actually emailed me and said we're trying to reproduce the B580 CPU overhead claims and we can't, I'd have been like, well, strap yourselves in. I have a lot of information for you. And there have been plenty of other guys. Again, I've spoken with Gamers Nexus on many issues at length. Guys like Andy from eTechnics, you can ask him. I've spent hours helping him with certain things, and he's been a great guy for me as well. The 285K testing most recently, it was Gear Seekers. They reached out and said, hey, the 285K is really quite punchy in a Plague Tale Requiem. And I was like, well, that goes against my data. I'm finding it to be an absolute turd there. And Nick was like, what the hell? Like, why would my data be so different to yours? And I said, well, let's dig in and find out. So I stopped what I was doing. I set aside some time to deal with Nick one-on-one. He showed me where he was testing. I said, straight away, I know what's going on there. The opening scene, very light on CPU load. So it becomes more of a throughput test for the CPU than it does, its processing capability. Go to the town where there's much more asked of the CPU, and it's not simply just throughputting light work. And he tested there, and he confirmed that what I was saying was true, that the 285K fell in a heap when you threw a heavy CPU load at it in a Plague Tale Requiem for whatever reason. And that is still the case to this date, mind you. Intel hasn't been able to address it. They've looked into it. They've tried to work out why the Core Ultra series is so bad in a Plague Tale Requiem, and a few other examples. They haven't fixed it to date. So I have plenty of examples where I am more than willing to help other YouTubers, and especially if a channel with 800,000 subscribers reached out. Like if you're, there's plenty of small channels that try to make a name for themselves by, shitting on Hardware Unboxed or Gamers Nexus or Linus Tech Tips. I'm really not going to entertain those guys. But yeah, a channel that, as far as I can tell, is quite well respected, and they do have a large audience. I'm always going to take the time to address that. So yeah, I mean, I also help out a lot of smaller channels as well, but I'll look at their backlog of content before I engage with them, because yeah, there's some interesting guys. But there are plenty of small channels there where I've sent them lots of hardware, motherboards, graphics cards, and stuff like that. There's a lot of guys that we help out like that as well. So yeah, but again, the burden for this isn't on us, and they can't just turn it into, well, Hardware Unboxed aren't being transparent enough that this is all their fault. I don't think that's good enough.
Yeah, totally agree.
They then conclude with a rather large paragraph here, Tim. They say, now we have enough data to move forward and double check Steve's data. Some would argue you had that to begin with, but that's great to hear. If we made a mistake, as stated in the first video, we will apologize. Okay, that's also great. This is what I was talking about earlier. If I was going to call out Hardware Canucks, which is the example I gave before, Tim and I would have involved Tim heavily in that process and said, can you verify all of this? Maybe, can you rip out your test system and please verify this data? I'd probably reach out to someone like Andy from eTechnics and go, mate, can you check this data? I'd reach out to the manufacturer. Hardware Canucks are claiming this, but we're finding the opposite. Who's right? Like, I would reach out to as many people as I could, and I wouldn't just go, well, Hardware Canucks is probably wrong because we can't confirm their results. But, if we're wrong, we'll apologize. Like, that's actually worse than the whole believe our testing kind of stuff, because you're basically saying, believe our testing because we're transparent, but also, if we got it wrong, we'll apologize. Like, you need to be certain of this stuff. I'm not going to call Gamers Nexus stuff fake and then go, but, as bad as that title is, if I'm wrong, I'll just apologize to Steve, give him a tap on the shoulder at Computex and go, remember that time I called your test fake and I was wrong? Yeah, here's a drink. Sorry about that one. Like,
I'm sure Steve at Gamers Nexus will just let you off the hook on that one if he ever did that.
He'd body slam me into the concrete probably, and I wouldn't blame him. So again, if that is the correct translation, bit weird. However, saying that our tests were bad, we don't know how to test. We don't know what to test or how to test, and suggesting that we delete our original video before retesting everything was rather unprofessional in our opinion. Okay, fair enough, but your tests were bad. if your tests as they are for just a GPU test, perfectly acceptable. Your data was accurate. I was able to confirm your data. So in that sense, you've done no wrong. The data is good. The data you're presenting is accurate. Why I said the tests were bad is because you are claiming to be investigating a claim made by us. The claim being that Intel's Arc B580 GPUs incur more of a CPU overhead relative to something like an RTX 4060. You did not investigate that at all. You claimed to investigate that. Is Hardware Unboxed testing wrong? Is it fake? And then you did GPU only testing, and you also tested the worst way possible to test real world gaming performance for CPU testing. So if someone comes to me and they say, I'm going to investigate this thing, and then they go about it in the completely wrong way, that tells me they're not very competent. So I would say they don't know how to test, or they don't know what it is they were testing. And look, it's not just me saying this. Everyone else was saying it as well. It was very clear to anyone who was even slightly tech savvy that they were investigating a CPU overhead issue while only testing GPU performance. What other conclusion can you draw?
It was a fair statement to call it bad. It's bad.
It's bad. And then claim that we should delete our original video. Well, based on the translation, you definitely should delete that video. Now, let's say the translation did you dirty and you weren't nearly as hostile and the comments weren't as bad as they were interpreted to be. Let's just say that's the case. Let's say all of them were misinterpreted. Should the video still be deleted where they conclude that there is no Arc CPU overhead issue and that our testing, there's something went wrong on our end? Yes, you should delete that video because you're wrong. Intel has confirmed there is a CPU overhead issue. And I mean, I don't know what you think of Digital Foundry, but their testing is generally pretty reliable, and they found the exact same thing. So I don't know where we go from here. Like, your claims are wrong. Like, it's very important that you quickly resolve this for your own credibility, because the vast majority of the internet knows the B580 has a CPU overhead issue to some degree. Now, again, we can argue about how relevant it is and who it's relevant for. Some of those angles, again, I'm not even exactly sure. It will be interesting to revisit this subject in years from now with more CPU demanding games and see how the B580 has aged. All I can say is right now, it's something you definitely want to be aware of if you have something like a Ryzen 5 5600 or slower. Absolutely want to be aware of this issue. Ryzen 5 3600 kind of becomes a deal breaker, in my opinion. 5600 right now, it's like, you can probably still use it, but depends on the games you play. And then I don't know moving forward from this. So I don't know. We'll move on then. At least we said in the video, we could be wrong, so we need more data.
Okay, right. So that's the same thing.
Yeah, it's like, mate, why did you ignore the most egregious examples like Spider-Man? We didn't say we were right and Hub were wrong. I don't know. I'll have to leave it up to I'll leave it up to people who can speak Russian to know whether that was true or not. The graphs themselves seem to suggest that was the case, and Steve seems confident that he's right. I mean, yeah, I do seem pretty confident that I'm right, and other sources who are very trusted and well respected in the industry prior to your video had already confirmed I was right. Pro High Tech, go to r/Intel or for the most biased possible answers, go to r/Intel or I think it's Intel Arc or Arc Intel.
Yeah, something like that.
Go to those places and say, do you guys believe that the Arc GPUs, the B580, for example, has a CPU overhead issue certainly more so than its competing parts, and see what people say. And then go to r/hardware and ask the question and see what they say. People already know this to be the case. They know it to be true. So yeah, that's why I think I'm right, because A, I've tested it, and B, other people who I really trust the opinion of have tested it and shown it to be an issue to varying degrees. Now, again, we can argue to the varying degrees of how much it matters, but you cannot say that it doesn't have more of a CPU overhead issue than a GeForce GPU, for example. Moving on. Maybe that's true, or maybe either way. We'll find out. Again, that's pretty wishy-washy and vague. I would never want to be that wishy-washy or vague when featuring another tech YouTuber in my thumbnail and discussing their results. But we've discussed that. At least if the bad thing is not that our tests are different from the Harbor Unbox tests due to different locations and different approach, which does not make them bad. No. It absolutely makes them bad if A, you're trying to verify my findings, and B, look at a CPU overhead issue. That shows that you are incompetent and don't know what you're doing. I can't claim to be benchmarking the effects of memory performance on games and then test two memory kits that are the same and then conclude it makes no difference. You know what I mean? Like, or
Yeah.
I can't, it's like saying are OLED monitors better and then not testing an OLED monitor and concluding, no, they're not better. You haven't tested the thing you set out to test. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is. And yeah, I think it's with this particular issue, it's not a matter of just testing in a different area, therefore both tests are right and there's just a difference of opinion on where to test. It's more about, how to test so that you produce the issue. And you could argue to the point where to the relevance of like how often you may be in areas where you'll see the issue, or how often you'll see these games, the configurations and that sort of thing. But if you want to say whether there is or isn't an issue, like as black and white as that, it's not a matter of someone testing in one area and another person testing in a different area and both being right. So anyway, continue.
Well, yeah, I was going to add to what you were saying, and say like if when I went to verify the Harbor Canucks results, they used a really old Core i5 9600K to make their point, which isn't technically on the supported CPU list, but I've got a few things to add to that. For example, how many people looking at a B580 that have an older CPU are actually aware of that more fine print supported stuff? You could argue that you should research that beforehand. But also it's a bit weird for a GPU to have those minimum requirements. It was thought to be mostly for resizable bar, but that's actually not the case. But anyway, if I looked into the Hardware Canucks claims, as I did, but I happened to test Space Marine 2, where the B580 achieves 53 frames per second on average with the Core i5 processor, if I had a GPU limited the game to where you could only render 50 FPS, which is what a GTX 1660 Super can do, then I would have concluded that there's no overhead problem because I'm no longer CPU limited. I'm now GPU limited. So I could have tested, Hogwarts Legacy with the same limitation. They tested Spider-Man Remastered. They got 74 frames per second with the Core i5 processor. They got 155 FPS with the 9800X 3D. But again, if I GPU limited the game in a way that, people would accept 74 FPS, right? So if I GPU limited my Spider-Man Remastered testing to 74 FPS and concluded there's the CPU overhead issue doesn't exist because I got 74 FPS and everything else got 74 FPS, that's essentially what Pro High Tech has done. So that would have been bad testing by me if I had done that. And the idea of the testing, again, is to show realistic configurations, but then to investigate something you can do for science testing to learn something additional that may be able to guide you in the recommendations you make or predict how the product will age. So knowing there's about a 20% CPU overhead can really aid you in making those recommendations and predictions. Moving on, they say, we are confident that our tests are correct in certain locations until proven otherwise. I said in my video that their data was accurate. It just wasn't looking at the thing they claimed to be looking at. So they should be confident their tests are correct in the locations they tested, because they are. I can tell you that now. The Pro High Tech testing is accurate. And the transparency of our approach allows everyone to double check our data. I mean, numbers are numbers, like realistically, like, you know. It will be immediately visible in the discussions. When a blogger only shows graphs and provides limited settings without gameplay or monitoring, it becomes difficult to reproduce their tests. Results may vary in other locations. I mean, we've already discussed all of it.
We've talked about that. That's just wrong.
They're really trying to, they're grasping at straws there to try and make out that, we're at fault. For
not showing enough information, you're at fault, which is just not true.
Yeah. I mean, again, Hardware Canucks only showed graphs. They showed the problem in their graphs, and that was enough for me and others. But again, Digital Foundry doesn't show graphs. They showed live gameplay with overlays. Admittedly, they're showing one overlay, which is the pass they're doing with frame time information. Anyway, Tim, that's pretty much it. So I don't feel the need to change or update anything in our video, apart from maybe the way that I interpreted some of their comments. But even then, it's not really clear to me yet. I've had a few different translations and interpretations of what they were saying. And essentially, they were suggesting some of the egregious things that we thought they were suggesting. It's just to... varying degrees.
Like how harsh is the language sort of thing.
Yeah. Which at the end of the day, I don't want to get too hung up on that anyway. I want to really focus on getting people the accurate information that Pro High Tech claim to be so hell-bent on doing. And that is informing people, is there or isn't there a CPU overhead issue that may impact your CPU's performance, depending on what your CPU is. Or even if you have a 5700X 3D right now, how is that going to age in the future? It's also a bit of a silly conversation anyway, because you can't buy the B580 anyway. Like, it costs as much as a GeForce GPU here in Australia, and they're terribly priced in the US.
Yeah, I mean, even if I sort of try and work away from the language barrier with the follow-up, and I sort of go, what was the intended meaning of this statement overall? Like, what were they trying to say? Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of trying to claim that we did things incorrectly in the original video, which made for a misunderstanding. Because that seems to be seems to be what the statement is saying, that Hardware Unboxed had done something incorrect, therefore that's why there's a misunderstanding with testing areas. Or that's like weasel word stuff.
You're trying to weasel out of it, in my opinion. I don't like that at all.
Yeah. So do you have anything else to say about the whole situation?
I think at this point I've said enough. I've pretty well covered it. I'm not excited about this at all. It's pretty annoying. And it just wasn't handled in a very... if you're going to call out a channel, you've got to do a better job than that. Especially when you've got 800,000 subscribers. The burden's really on you to do a better job than that, because... if we call out Gamers Nexus, let's say we make up a fake video and we do our best to make it seem convincing and we expose something they've done, let's say in their FSR testing or something like that. We could be completely wrong. It's still going to create a huge headache for them.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to get the hell. We've got 1.1 million subscribers. We get comfortably over 100,000 views on most videos, just like Pro High Tech. We're going to send the angry mob their way, and they may be working on other stuff. I said in my video, I didn't actually want to be talking about this issue again, at least not now, maybe in a year from now, or when it's relevant to talk about it again. Maybe when either the B580 comes back into stock and is available at $250 US, or a new generation comes out and we revisit the subject. I didn't want to do it 3 months afterwards, and I didn't want to deal with this crap when I was on holiday with my family. But that's to a lesser degree. But it was just unnecessary. Yep. I didn't want to deal with the fallout of someone calling us out to a degree. I don't know exactly how they called us out. We can only sort of look at the interpretation. But a lot of native Russian viewers seemed to think they were saying that our testing was wrong and fake. So I don't know what led so many native Russian speakers to believe that. But
yep. Yeah, I don't like to wield the power of the, like, I don't know whether we have a power of a mob, but you know what I mean, right? Like,
well, we definitely can. The channel's big enough now, whereas if we aim that at someone else, it's going to blow up in our face if we lie and we get it wrong. But we can definitely take up someone like Steve from Gamers Nexus's time and create a headache for him short term and make him focus on something he doesn't want to focus on.
Yeah, and I don't like using that or doing something that would encourage people to do, like, even using it is kind of wrong. Like, you sort of, here everyone, go harass someone. That's like, why would you ever have that opinion? You should just never do that. But I'm thinking more about, like, there is a style of video that can be made where people will be encouraged to do that even if you don't explicitly say it. And I just don't like creating content where that would be the outcome.
And that's the content I just made. Tons of people went and attacked Pro High Tech. But I needed to make that video to defend our testing. And really, once you're called out in that manner and they stick your face in the thumbnail, there was tons of people on Reddit and in our comment section demanding that we address it. And I probably could have ignored it, but
not for something like that.
You can't really.
I sort of contrast it to remember when Linus employee was caught on camera making some comments about our testing, and that blew up into a thing. That we didn't make a video about that outside of discussing on the podcast when there was that whole.
Well, they were minor comments, like
but that's what I mean, right? It's like
I had a cheeky, what in my opinion was meant to be a cheeky shot at them on X. I took the piss a bit, but I wasn't going to make a dedicated video about it.
But that's what I mean, is that the degree to which you go after someone, the response. If Linus had made an entire video saying, like, the comments that were made in private that were caught on camera made that into a whole video, then you better believe there'll be a response. But I mean, if it's if Pro High Tech made a tweet or something, it would be a very different scenario. But the fact that the video got 100,000 views or whatever it was, and
it's comfortably over 100,000 views it got,
So as long as you've got all your ranting out of the way, and
we can wrap this up now.
We can close this topic, because we're not going to be making follow-up videos, I wouldn't imagine.
No, we're done with it.
Probably it for this content. They may make more testing, I'm not sure, but
they can continue to call us out if they want, or say whatever they want at this point. I've defended ourselves. I've shown that how and where I believe their testing were wrong and where their shortcomings were. I'm done with it. But
it was the video and this podcast to elaborate on some things. But I understand the concerns of people that we're going to make this a drama issue. We're going to go back and forth. We're not a drama channel. We've really trying to avoid. I know some people don't believe us on this, but we really do try and avoid drama and creating YouTuber versus YouTuber drama as much as possible.
I think that's pretty self-evident, because this is an extreme rarity.
We've been called a drama channel before, so I'm just trying to mitigate the people who are a little bit. I mean, if you've listened to the podcast the whole way through, you're probably accepting of what's going on. If you didn't like drama, you've probably turned it off by now. But anyway, I just want to say, for clarity, I hate making these videos. You said that you hate making these videos. We don't really want to be talking about this. We just want to be providing good, useful information for people. We want most of the videos on our channel, the majority of the videos, to be good consumer advice, accurate consumer advice for people. That's what our channel is about. So when these things come out, it's last resort sort of stuff.
And if Pro High Tech, do go and retest, and they test Spider-Man, they find what we and others have shown, and I don't really care about the apology too much. I still do think they should delete the original video, though I would like a more accurate translation to make that determination. But at the same time, they are investigating something without actually investigating it properly or at all really in the testing. The testing doesn't investigate it in the least. It just confirms what we already know. When GPU limits, it's not a problem. So we showed that side of the story and explained that. That's the only side of the story they explored. So anyway, but again, if they update the testing, they find a bit more and go, well, actually, under these conditions, there is a CPU bottleneck, but we don't believe it's a problem for the most part. So we still think it's a non-issue. I'd be like, cool, fine. That's fine. Moving on. You don't have to agree with us to the degree. And we don't really know as to the severity, like the degree of how severe the issue is. It's a tough one.
Yep. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's podcast. No boring life stuff because Steve talked for an hour and a half about another channel. So, and to be honest, I don't even have anything to say. So we'll just keep that all.
We'll do a double one next week if we have time.
Yeah, there'll be a few things to talk about next week, but that's maybe interesting. So keep your eyes on the channels next week to see what's happening. But yeah, until then, we've got the Hardware Unboxed supporter feed. If you're a Patreon member, you get access to an ad-free podcast feed. We put the Q&As, we put our live streams in there. Plus, as a Patreon member, you get all the other benefits of being a member, so our Discord chat, all that sort of thing. Outside of that, appreciate people listening to the end of these videos and liking and subscribing our channel, the Hardware Unboxed podcast on YouTube, and obviously listening in all the audio feeds. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.